Hey friends, welcome back to my kitchen. If you're new here, hi, my name is Jen. I do cooking, canning, and food preservation videos every Tuesday, and I do vlogs on Friday. If that seems like the sort of content you're into, I hope you'll consider subscribing and sticking around. Today we're going to be making Moroccan chicken stew. Now the first ingredient to this recipe is saffron threads. This is very expensive. Normally I would not have saffron threads, but I caught them on sale at the Homage Salvage store and I snatched them up because the price I couldn't walk past them and not buy them. So if you do not have saffron, you can substitute the saffron in this recipe for a little bit of turmeric. It may change the flavor a tiny bit, but it will add that very bright yellow color that you're looking for with the saffron threads. So I'm just going to start off here with a pinch of saffron threads and I'm going to add it into some cold water. And I'm going to let this kind of soak and let all that beautiful color and flavor out of those saffron threads while I'm getting everything else prepped for this recipe. I'm not going to be giving you exact measurements in this recipe because this is not my own recipe. I found this over on Silk Road Recipes and it was posted by someone named Kevin. It's a really great website. I'll post a link to their website down below, and when you go to print the recipe, it even gives you the option to change the serving amounts, which changes the recipe and the amounts that you'll need to make this meal. Now, I'm just going to get started by chopping up some celery. Full transparency here, I wasn't wearing my glasses when I was reading the recipe and it said finely chopped celery. So once I get this all chopped through, I realize that I made a mistake and some of the celery is chopped kind of thick and I just go back and run my knife through it. But you definitely want to chop your celery a little thinner than I did. It didn't change the outcome of the stew at all, but for folks that have an issue with texture, just chop your celery a little finer than I did. And then I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing with my onions. I'm going to finely chop my onions into long strips. At this point, I had put my glasses on so I wouldn't mess this recipe up for you guys. But yeah, you're just going to want to, cut your onion long ways so that you come out with strips instead of dicing it. And it adds a really lovely texture, these long pieces of onions in this stew. And this is literally the hardest part of this recipe. Is just the prep work, chopping your celery and your onions, and everything else goes really quickly. So once I get all that chopped up, I'm going to add some olive oil to a very large pan because as you all know, I am cooking for 6 adults. So, recipes have to be magnified quite a bit to feed my crew. And then to this, I'm going to add some butter and I'm going to get this just on a medium high heat just to get the butter melted, and then we're going to go ahead and start putting this stew together. Now that the butter and the oil is hot, I'm going to go ahead and add all of my onions into this and I'm going to saute them for about 3 or 4 minutes. I'm just cooking these onions until they're starting to turn kind of translucent. I don't want to cook them until they're caramelized or just absolutely cooked to death because this whole dish is going to sit and simmer for a while. And I do want these onions to have a little bit of texture still once the dish is done. So to this, I'm going to add salt to help these onions sweat out a little bit. And I'm just going to keep an eye on them to make sure that they don't burn. And once I can kind of see through the edges of the onions, I'm going to go ahead and add all of my celery in. Now this is going to need to saute for a little bit longer because celery is a tougher texture than onions. In fact, in my personal opinion, the celery probably should have been added before the onions, but I'm just going by Kevin's recipe and he said onions first, so that's what we're doing. Now at this point, I'm going to start adding some of my seasonings. I'm adding black pepper. I'm also going to add garlic powder. You could use fresh garlic if you like. Recipe said garlic powder, so that's what I'm going with. And I'm going to add some ground cumin. And I'm just going to give this a quick stir to make sure the spices are all incorporated, and I'm going to let this saute until the celery starts to get soft. It only took about 3 or 4 minutes on medium heat. Now, I saved myself some time on this day, and I went ahead and roasted some chicken breast earlier in the day and just put it in the refrigerator. You could use rotisserie chicken for this recipe, or you can use raw chicken. That's fine. Your stew is just going to have to cook a little longer at the end. So I'm just gonna dice this up. I just roasted this with pretty much the same seasonings that are in the stew: salt, pepper, garlic powder, a little bit of onion powder. I didn't want to add anything too wild because I didn't want the flavors to conflict. But yeah, just chopping it into small cubes. If you're using rotisserie, just shred the chicken. And if you're using raw, just cut it into small pieces. And you'll add that in at the very end and let the chicken cook inside the stew. So I'm checking here to make sure that the celery is starting to get tender. And from this point, I'm going to add the rest of the spices. First, I'm going to add some tomato paste. This is going to add a lovely flavor to this stew. And the next ingredient may be sort of hard for you to find if you're not close to an international market. I order mine off of Amazon, but it is harissa paste. I used this once before in a recipe, and I had purchased the hot harissa paste. So this time I decided to go ahead and get the medium, just because there are a couple people in my house that don't care for spice very much. And I wanted them to be able to enjoy this meal and not fuss the entire time about how hot it was. This really didn't have much heat to it, but it had a wonderful flavor. So I'm going to add some of this harissa paste to it, and I'm going to stir this around really well to make sure that all of that harissa paste and tomato paste is broken up. And at this point, we're also going to add the saffron threads and the water that it was soaking in to the pan. If you are substituting turmeric, you want to add your turmeric and your water at this point. It's going to serve the same purpose as the saffron threads, and it's going to save you a ton of money in the end, unless you're lucky like me and you happen to catch saffron on sale somewhere. So I'm just going to continue to mix this and let the raw flavor of the tomato paste cook out. Um, Tomato paste sometimes, especially when it's out of a can, can have sort of a tinny taste to it. So we're gonna kind of cook that out. And once everything is heated through, then we're gonna move on to the next step, and that is what is gonna cause our stew to be thick. Just like if I were making gravy, like mushroom and onion gravy or something, I'm gonna add flour into my vegetables and that harissa paste. And I'm going to stir this around just like I did with the tomato paste, and I'm going to let the raw flour kind of cook. You don't want to just immediately add your liquid after doing this. You want this flour to hydrate and just kind of cook off that raw flavor. Not going to do it for too long. We don't want it to burn, just until all of the flour is hydrated. And you can absolutely adjust your heat at this point if you need to keep from scalding or burning the tomato paste or burning the flour in this step. Then I'm going to add some chicken broth to this. This is my home canned chicken broth. This probably the best chicken broth I've ever made. My only complaint is I wish I had used a finer sieve to get some of the little particles out of the jar so that it was more clear, but it does have delicious flavor, and I'm going to use it. I'm just going to add that right into my mixture at this point. And I do end up adding just a little bit of water to it as well to make it go a little farther. I didn't want to open a whole nother jar of broth just for a couple cups. And I have no pint jars of broth, so a little bit of water in. And then I'm going to mix this until all of the big pieces or lumps of flour and harissa paste and tomato paste are combined. And it's going to be really soupy at first, but we're going to let this simmer for a little while. And as it simmers, just like with any kind of gravy or anything like that, it does thicken up. You can let this go until it's super thick if that's what you want, or you can leave it more soupy if you prefer a soupier stew. We like it pretty thick around here, so I do let this go for a little while, just keeping an eye on it, making sure that it doesn't burn to the bottom of the pan. And just a couple of minutes later, you can see that it is starting to thicken up. So we're going to go ahead and add the last of the ingredients. I'm adding canned chickpeas, and I'm also going to add in all of that chicken that I chopped up. Now, like I said, if you're using raw chicken, this next and final step is going to take you a little bit longer. For me, I only had to simmer this for about 15 minutes with the lid on, just to heat the chickpeas through. Canned chickpeas are already cooked. I already cooked my chicken, so I'm just heating everything back up at this point and letting the sauce get thicker. If you're putting raw chicken into this, you need to make sure that you cook this until your chicken is completely done. And bear in mind that if you are adding raw chicken, it's going to add more juices to your gravy, so it may take longer for your gravy to thicken. And as a side dish tonight, I just made a big pot of couscous to serve with this. You could have this with rice. Kevin suggests on his website also having it with cucumber salad. And I check on it at this point and I decide that it's pretty close to where I want it. I did let it simmer for a couple more minutes with the lid off so that it would thicken a little more. And then I decide it's time for dinner. We're gonna go ahead and plate this up. And I wish I had smell-o-vision because my house smelled so good. It smelled spicy and warm, and this meal was very filling. In fact, we have leftovers for dinner tonight, and everybody absolutely loves it. I'm really glad I went with the mild harissa paste. The last thing I'm going to do is garnish this with a little bit of pesto, and we'll mix this in right before we eat it, and it is fantastic. So I really hope that you give this recipe a try. Step out of your comfort zone and try something maybe you've never had before. I 10 out of 10 recommend this recipe. If you try it, leave me a comment and let me know what you thought about it. And until next time, friends, happy cooking.
Overthink it, baby. It's just me.